Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Social Housing Roundtable. My name is Matt Baird. I've been doing social housing recruitment now for nearly 12 years. I completely fell into the sector as so many people have done. And once I set up on my own a couple of years ago, in terms of 2.5 years ago nearly, from a recruitment perspective, I wanted to carry on with these roundtables, which I've started very intermittently during the lockdown and COVID periods, to try and give people a chance to have a voice about a number of different subjects, to really try and make change. And I was recently asked about, how much change can you really make? And a lot of this is actually just about information sharing, knowing what's out there, knowing what your options are, and trying to get people around the table, because there just aren't enough chances to do it for free in the social housing world. A lot of the conferences and things cost a lot of money. And so it's always a pleasure to host different people in different settings for these conversations. All of the previous recordings are on YouTube, or the majority. I think there's about 65 or 66 of them now, so do go check those out. But for now, welcome to today for a topic that we haven't actually discussed before on the Social Housing Roundtable, which is shared ownership. An interesting one. I realised that when Floris reached out to me, I was just looking back and through, and so often I think we've discussed every kind of, at least broadly, every topic that comes up in social housing, and then I keep being stunned with more and more that come through. So it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Floris Nijenhuis to the Social Housing Roundtable. I'm going to let him kind of do his introductions and everything else, but as ever, I'm pretty sure we got connected via LinkedIn. It seems to be the platform where everyone reaches out to me these days, said, "Hey Matt, can we do a discussion on this on the roundtable?" And as ever, A, it's going to be a yes almost always, but B, if anyone has got an idea they'd like to bring to the roundtable, please do reach out. So without further ado, Floris, over to you. Please, as I introduce yourself, Pluto, and I guess why you wanted to bring this topic to the table today. Over to you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Matt. I think it was actually David Montague who introduced us, and I think he knows a thing or two about shared ownership. So yeah, my name is Floris. I'm the founder of Pluto. We are a technology company that has essentially focused in the last year building a platform to automate various parts of shared ownership. And the reason why I wanted to talk today is that over the last year, we've spoken to lots and lots and lots of shared ownership residents, and so much has come up in terms of their customer experience. And, buying a shared ownership property isn't just about getting on the property ladder. It's a very emotional journey, that one, to becoming a homeowner. So there's lots to think about there, and I thought it'd be good to condense all of the sort of feedback we've been getting from residents over the last year and share some of that with you, and hopefully I can report that back and we can all learn something from it. So if I can manage to work
just while you're sharing your screen, if anyone has got any comments at any time, please put them in the chat, or feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. I will then obviously be bringing people in to raise points if they'd like to via the raise hand function on the reactions. Raise your hand, I'll bring you into the conversation. We want this to be as open a discussion as possible. But for now, yes, I say, Floris, I can see your screen, so it looks like we're sharing successfully.
Awesome. All right, perfect. So yeah, as I said earlier, I'm the founder of Pluto. Although it says Stepper here as a logo, Stepper is actually the platform that we launched. As the name says, it's got something to do with staircasing, but I'll tell you more about that later. My background is in tech, so I've been starting tech companies for the last 5-6 years. And a bit like Matt, I fell into social housing in the last year, and I'm super passionate about it. And yeah, I wanted to share something back with you. So the topic today is obviously designing the perfect customer experience for shared ownership residents. I think before we can think about, what the perfect experience looks like, I wanted to talk about what the current experience looks like. So if I can, is this working? Yes. So let's run through quickly what the current experience looks like for a shared ownership resident. So, you want to get onto the property ladder, you're thinking of buying a home, you typically end up on Google. So you'll go on Google and you type in shared ownership, and you just get bombarded with a load of random information. It could be articles on the BBC saying, watch out, shared ownership is really hard to get out of. You might get a random article from realistically Peabody, L&Q, or Clarion, because they're the biggest ones and they've got the most SEO. You'll get shared to buy maybe with some of their articles. But the important thing is that none of this is coming from the housing associations, or that there's not much control from the housing association's perspective in terms of the customer experience. If somebody wants to go and buy the property, they could go on a housing association website, but most likely they will go on Share to Buy or another platform like that. And again, you're not really controlling anything as a housing association in terms of your relationship and how that starts with the residents. If somebody does choose to buy a property, then at that point, yes, you do have a relationship. But again, if somebody wants to staircase, most of the time they're just told, go on our website, download a PDF, choose a solicitor, choose a RIC surveyor, choose a mortgage broker. You're kind of doing everything by yourself. And there's not much chance to build a rapport with the resident. If somebody wants to sell, then they normally say, you know, who can help me? And the answer tends to be something along the lines of, we'll try and sell it as a housing association because we don't want to lose the stock. But if we can't manage it, it'll end up on Zoopla. And that process can be very annoying to go through. And we've spoken to many residents who are quite upset about that. And it's no surprise that you can find a load of articles online of people saying, yeah, look, shared ownership was a dream for me, but it's turned out to be incredibly difficult. And that's not me saying it, that's residents saying it. So I wanted to put, and I promise you this is the last bit of bad news, everything from here is positive. But you know, you can see a lot of resident feedback about what happens when the process falls apart. It's so sad to see that such a fantastic scheme can end up becoming a total nightmare for some people, and you can see that, you know, £20,000 is such a load of money for anyone living in shared ownership. And it's important to mention that I don't think housing associations have any intention of doing anything wrong. I just think without the right processes, it's really difficult to manage, in some cases, you know, 10,000 residents. And what I'd really love over the next couple of years is to improve the Trustpilot reviews, because I think we can all agree that 1.6 out of 5 as a G15 is not good enough. I think Goldman Sachs has a better Trustpilot review, and we all know how much we trust Goldman Sachs. So I think I wanted to start the presentation with a question, and that's, you know, if you were to pitch your current shared ownership process, and I assume most of the people in the room will be somehow dealing with shared ownership residents, but if you were to pitch your current shared ownership process to your board, do you think you would get approval? If the answer is no, or if you had to think about it, then you should probably have a go at changing things. So today I want to start from zero and think about what the key ingredients are to an amazing customer experience. And from all the feedback that we gathered from residents over the last year, there are 3 key things that they need to feel in order to, you know, tell everyone that they're being well looked after. One's information, then communication, and the last one is process. And over the next, hopefully 20 minutes or less, because I want to leave as much time as possible for questions, I want to show you why these 3 principles matter when you're trying to build relationships with people. Before I do that, I think it's worth saying that there are 3 main interactions that residents told us that they care about the most in shared ownership. And I think we probably all know what they are, but just to spell out the obvious is buying, because obviously that's super emotional when you're buying the house. It's staircasing, because that's your journey towards being 100% owner, and reselling. So resales are an incredibly emotional point. And for this presentation, I will focus on staircasing because that's what we look at day in, day out. But I think the same principles apply to the other 2. And in fact, I think that these 3 principles actually apply to any relationship. So I was feeling in a fun mood this morning, and this might break down, but I wanted to add a little bit of humor, and I wanted to compare a social housing shared ownership relationship to another incredibly emotional journey, and show you how important it is to have those 3 principles right. And that journey is dating. So if anyone has any questions, please stop me. And if it falls apart, then let me know. But I'm going to compare staircasing to dating. So what's the first principle that you need? I think it's information. Whether it's staircasing or dating, you want to ask yourself the 3 main questions. What am I getting into? Can I trust you? And is that the full story? You don't go on a date with a random person without doing some research. So why do housing associations think that it's okay to have a rubbish website that talks about a gazillion different things and says download a PDF to find out about staircasing. Sometimes that link is broken, and sometimes that PDF was written 15 years ago. Why do you think that's good enough to make someone part with £100,000 do staircase? It's just not good enough. If you also want to know that the advice that you're being given is reliable and the complete picture, residents always speak to one another. Every resident we spoke to who has staircase asked 10 other residents, how did it go? What was the journey? And how did it, did it work out for you? And if the answer was no, no one else in that building staircases. And I know I can tell you a few buildings in London where one person had a terrible experience and it just doesn't go ahead. So you can bracket all of this as information. Residents need information. They need that information to be comprehensive, reliable, and up to date. Are there any questions before I move on to the next slide? No. Okay. The next key point is communication. If you pour your heart out to someone and they blank you, would you want to ever talk to them again? Probably not. So why do housing associations think it's okay for somebody to apply to staircase and wait a month to get back to them? There are some people who've been waiting 9 months for their staircasing transaction to complete. If that were you, and would you be okay with it? Would you want to carry on that relationship with that housing association? I think the answer is probably no. I think you need to be consistent, you need to build trust, and you need to know that one mistake can break it all. And that could be blanking someone, that could be messing up the building or whatever it is. But I think it's hugely important to communicate to residents, always let them know where they are. And finally, communication is about listening. It's not just about telling them, this is what happens next, this is what you're going to do. It's also about taking feedback. And to have a great customer experience, you need to be able to take feedback from residents very well. And there are lots of residents who complain about not being able to give feedback, or they give feedback, but they don't feel like anybody's listening to it. And the last point, as I mentioned, it's process. So whether it's in carrying on with this odd dating analogy, whether it's who takes the kids to school on what day, or whose job it is to empty the bins, people always want to know what the process is, and they want to know exactly where they are in that process. I'm sure all of you have a process already for shared ownership, but do you communicate it to your residents? Do you communicate to them, these are the 25 steps required in staircasing, and this is the order that you're going to go in, and this is what you're currently sat in your application process? Do they know where they stand? If no, is there a reason for that? Have you been avoiding taking the bins out, perhaps? There are things that could be slow in your end, and it's better to let people know. If something's going wrong, let them know. Don't leave them in the dark. Ultimately, even if things go wrong, you can always stay friends. And I think that's what's happening in this screenshot down here, which is a bit weird. But as you can see on the picture, it doesn't always end well. But you'd never want to leave a sour taste in someone's mouth. And I think bringing it back to that slide with all the horrible, newspaper cuttings, it's the people who have a terrible experience who end up in the press giving a bad name to the housing association. So always make sure that the people who aren't having a good time, you're there to look after. Any questions, or shall I carry on?
I think we're carrying on.
Good. All right, we're going ahead. So to summarize, I think the three main things that you need to build a good customer experience for your residents are a reliable, up-to-date, and readily accessible bank of information. You need timely and consistent communication. And finally, you need transparent and standardized process. You might be asking yourself, how can I achieve all of these things with such little resources? And that's always the feedback that I get from housing associations. Like, Floris, you're a dreamer. What you're talking about sounds really, great. And we'd love to do all of that, but we don't have infinite resources. There's not an unlimited budget. So how do we do that? Well, in my mind, the only way to really make sure that you do things consistently, it's through technology. Because automation is the only thing that allows you to standardize things and make them work smoothly and, importantly, predictably. Residents and yourselves need to know predictably what's going to happen next so that there's no curveballs. It might shock you to hear this, but Matt wouldn't have invited me otherwise. So I'm going to say, luckily for you, we have built something to try and fix this. Essentially, we have launched it actually quite recently, and that's our app, StairPay. So StairPay is a platform that allows residents to know exactly what they're getting into. They have 1 million financial calculators to figure out exactly where they are or what happens next, whether it's stamp duty calculations, staircasing, property values. Our automation allows residents to know the full picture of whatever's happening in their staircasing transaction. We source our data from the likes of the land registry and other super well verified resources to make sure that the residents trust the information that we're giving them. We also educate residents and introduce them to financial experts who can give them the right advice. And we're building a scenario planner that allows residents to see, I could staircase today, but what are my alternatives? And what do those pan out in the next 2 years if I choose not to staircase? We don't force them to make any decisions because we understand that they're not pawns, they're human beings. And, we present them with all of their options and we try to work through each one of them. And, that's the information that we try to give them. When it comes to communication, we've built a StairPay Academy, which is essentially a free online resource that teaches residents everything they need to know about staircasing. We update it weekly with articles that are requested from residents. So it's always information that residents have said that they don't have. We allow housing associations to be consistent by crowdsourcing material from shared ownership experts and presenting it in a simple, easily digestible format. And we also allow residents to leave feedback. So there's a very prominent button on our app that says, do you need any new features? Is there anything you're confused about? Tell us, and we will build that for you. So we try to make that communication 2 ways. When it comes to process, obviously this is the bit that you'd hope the technology can solve because software is all about automation. And we built the first end-to-end fully automated staircasing tool for 1% staircasing, which is, the new Homes England, new leases, mandated staircasing that you have to allow your residents to do. But we realized that for larger transactions, people want to speak to humans, lawyers need to be involved, and therefore we're also partnering with the top solicitors and shared ownership to facilitate transactions as quickly as possible. The main thing the residents complained to us about was not knowing what comes next. But with StairPay, they always know where they are. As you can see from the screenshot, they always know in the app, what's going to come next, what's happened, who's blocking things, on what they did, what happened. And they absolutely love that because it allows them to feel in control of the staircasing transaction. The main thing is we hope to give residents such a good experience that they'll tell everyone they know about shared ownership. And it's free, surprise, surprise. So that's also why they like it. Regardless of whether their landlord signs up, a shared ownership resident can sign up to our app. It's easy for them to do so. If you want to tell some of your residents to do so, they just need to go on stairpay.com and they can just create an account. But it's not just residents that we help. We've also built a platform for housing associations. So I'll go through this one super quickly because I know that today we're talking about residents, so I don't want to spend too long on this. But we have also built the first CRM that's specific to shared ownership that allows housing associations to track interactions with residents from start to finish. We allow you to maximize staircasing by making sure that everyone who can transact knows about it and has the right tools made available to them. And finally, and I think this is probably the most important one, we allow housing associations to capture crucial data on their residents, such as which residents are struggling with affordability, not just the affordability of being able to staircase, but their current situation, who's struggling to pay rent, and is there anything that you can do about it? Most of the housing associations that we speak to currently rely on spreadsheets to track the initial sales, resales, and staircasing, and any other transaction, which means that when someone moves in, they have all the right information. About a year later, all of that information is outdated. It's inaccessible to most team members, and it's impossible to interpret. You can't make forecasts or spot trends based on rows and rows and rows of data unless you're a genius, which I'm not. But our software has up-to-date data on all of your residents, their financial well-being, and any transaction that they'd like to start. And so we can allow you to forecast the future as well as making sense of what happened in the past and what's currently happening. So if you want to know a little bit more about it, then feel free to email me after this call. I'm going to leave my email with Matt, and you can see it on the last slide. So I'd like to leave you with this little anecdote before I open up for questions. It's something I found on LinkedIn that keeps coming up, and it's essentially, it's a CFO asking a CEO, what happens if we invest in developing our people through, education and training, and they leave us? And the CEO responds, well, what happens if we don't and they all stay? I think the same can be said about shared ownership customer experience. It might seem like investing in customer journey is pointless when there's few resources and some residents may leave you. But all of the ones who stay and have a bad time are actually the ones who probably end up on the paper, and they end up giving you horrible reviews, and they end up actually ruining the image of what I think is a great scheme. So going back to my earlier question, if you don't think you'd get approval for your current process, then you should probably reach out and we should have a conversation, and make sure that you tell your residents to sign up to a free app. And with that, I'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Floris, and a really interesting insight there, I think, into the some of the stigma and things that sits around with shared ownership. I think from just in terms of me kicking off the questions, and say if anybody has got anything, please use the raise hand function. I'm amazed that you said the word data and Claire hasn't dived in yet, but I'll come back to that in a bit. And obviously use the chat function if you don't want to come in on the video itself or on the recording. But I think for me, when you're speaking to housing associations, how are they, from an outside perspective, how are they viewing shared ownership internally as a measure at the moment? And what's the overall perspective you're getting? Is it something that, I'm with you, I think it's a fantastic scheme and could be excellent, but is it still seen that way by the RPs you're speaking with, or is it seen as almost a poison chalice, a bit of a nightmare sector to try and navigate at the minute?
I think there's quite a few things that they worry about. They obviously love shared ownership as a product, and they think it's a great way to get people onto the property ladder. I think it's a good moneymaker for the business. I think there's different players in shared ownership. There's the housing associations that have been around for 50 plus years, and then there's the new players, the private players who have a much more modern portfolio that they bought, the best homes in the last few years. And they may not necessarily even want staircasing sometimes. Some of the older housing associations sometimes have some stock that I'm not sure how much they advertise this, but they would happily like to get rid of. And therefore staircasing is a great system. But I always say to them, look, take a step back and why does shared ownership exist? Shared ownership exists to get people onto the property ladder. And hopefully part of that promise is to get them to 100%. And therefore, staircasing has to be part of your agenda, has to be part of your C-level conversations. And I think in most places it is, but I think the maximum you can have is 10% of your portfolio shared ownership. 90% is always going to be social rent, and therefore you don't really want to put all of your eggs into one basket and think too much about shared ownership when actually you've got X many thousand residents that you've got to worry about on the other end.
Completely fair. Really appreciate it. Claire, thank you. I'm glad the nudge highlighted. It'd be good to have you with us. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Matt. Thanks for that. Yes, I was busily making notes, and won't be surprised I have lots to say. No, all good about the StairPay app and the platform. I have to say, the things that you were talking about just absolutely ring true with me. You've talked about comprehensive information, reliable, up-to-date information, transparency. They are all things that are in the GDPR, which people don't think they are. People kind of think of that as data quality, and they think of GDPR as just security and nothing else. And it's so much more than that. I'm actually, a little plug for Friday, I'm doing an event on Friday morning with Golden Marzipan to talk about GDPR being an asset rather than an obstacle. But what strikes me is that everything you're saying is great, and it would work really brilliantly if the foundation is there. And if it's not, if the reliable data isn't there as a foundation in the housing association, couldn't the app just make it a bit more messy and a bit more confusing? That's what I worry about. I worry about that people go out and buy tech, or housing associations go out to buy tech to try and fix the problem, where actually it can't really fix it on its own. I don't know if there's a question there. That's just
no, I think I know what you're trying to say. There are two things that I'd say about that. One is that over the last year, and many of the conversations that we've had and we've spoken to, I think everyone on the G team by now, and a lot of the smaller housing associations as well. And the data is not in a clear, comprehensive format. And you're right. When we said, look, you can just sign up to our app and then you can read the data, they said, well, if we don't know where the data is, and what are you going to help us with? Which I think is the point you're trying to make. So part of the reason why we initially said that you could only use our app as a resident if your housing association signed up and they invited you, because we thought they'd want to control that. But then we actually thought there's a lot of this data which is publicly available, and the land registry has a wealth of information, and also residents have a lot of this information, and theirs is up to date. It's as up to date as it can be, right? So we decoupled the provider app, which is what we call a housing association app, to the resident one, and residents actually now crowdsource a lot of this data. So how much did you buy your property for, on what date? They know that information, right? The housing association might have lost it. What percentage of the property do you currently own? And when's the last time you tried a staircasing application? All of this data, the resident, because we sort of gamified it, and we said, do you want to know all this information about your property? Do you want to know what it's worth today? Yes. Well, then you need to tell us how much you bought it for. And they get something, but also we get something, and we know what they initially bought it for. So we basically tried to gamify the system to try and gather this useful information, and that hopefully relieves some of the pressure on the housing association from having to find that all themselves. The other thing that I would say is, well, if you have the data and you don't actually try to use technology, then going back to my last point, well, what happens if you do nothing? I doubt that the situation is going to get any better. We've actually offered to some housing associations to take all of their Excel sheets, and we have some data whizzes in our team. I think one is actually listening in, so shout out to Isaac. And him and the rest of us can try and analyze all the data for you, because it's a lot easier if you look at it as a removed party, and we can say, we'll upload that data into a format that anyone then from the sales team or marketing team who isn't necessarily a SQL expert who can write Python can, just look at a graph and say, oh, that's really interesting. Last year, we did a campaign about staircasing and our revenue went up 20%, which is something that we've heard in some webinars. So we can try and do that for you, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. Does that make sense? Does that answer your non-question?
Yes, I think so. I think the two have to go hand in hand. You've got to get the data, the source data right, and have it in the first place, like you say. And then having something like your app to present it, does make sense.
But there's also the fact that, sorry to interrupt, but there's also, when you sign up to, and you might choose to go somewhere else, that's fine. But when you sign up to technology, you start gathering the data from that particular point in time. So the back exercise, which everyone dreads, has to be done at some point anyway, but you might as well start gathering the data from now on, right? Otherwise, you're just making that problem bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
There was a question from Tony Bradley, but I can't quite work out the question, Tony. So do feel free to come in. You're on mute at the moment. Do feel free to come in if you want to kind of, you're still on mute. Tony, you're on mute. Oh, okay. He's on. I can't. I assume he can't get the microphone working. I think that might be what he's saying. I'm not sure.
Is that better?
That is, yes. Thank you.
Yeah. It should have been 2 housing associations that I know of stop doing repairs on properties as soon as an application to buy, or even on shared ownership, is received. They just say, we're not doing any repairs. The new owner can take over.
Right.
Do I think that's right?
Right.
No. I don't know if much needs to be added. No, I don't think that that's right. I think the housing association has the responsibility to look after not just their asset, but also, their residents. And I think that some associations are trying to get away with saving some money by, cutting corners where they shouldn't be, then I don't think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, you could say, well, they could stop doing repairs once the deal is completed, but not at the time the application is received.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the new shared ownership format that says that the housing association is responsible for repairs is probably, no housing association won't be too happy about it, but from the residents' perspective, the feedback is that it's super well received. I think at the very least, you should split the cost according to your percentage share. But I think, the new legislation says that it's a housing association that has to do it for the first, I think it's 15 or 10 or 15 years, which, they get the benefits of scale. They can probably do things at a much cheaper rate than if a resident just called up and asked a random maintenance person to help them with something.
Yeah.
Really interesting. And I mean, I was going to ask you about this because obviously when you and I were coming up with a theme for today, it was designing the perfect customer experience. So how much work have you and Pluto done with residents in order to kind of help design this service, but also as a two-parter, I guess, what you've mentioned there, the three areas that we need to kind of work on are accessible information that's up to date and reliable, there's timely, consistent comms, and that transparent kind of standardized process. Are those the three kind of topics that you've noticed kind of from the outside, or is that the ones that they're bringing to you, or maybe it's both?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the biggest thing that everyone always talks about is I don't trust the information I'm being given, or I'm not being given the full picture. And I think that's the saddest one because that's the easiest one to fix. It's really easy to say to someone, here's all the next steps. If you think that the process that you created is right, why would you be ashamed of telling the resident, by the way, there's 13 steps involved. This is what's going to happen. And that's a lot of what we try to add to the app. I have to also say that it's not just the housing association. If you think of staircasing, there's a bank involved, there's a RIC surveyor involved, and there's a solicitor involved, and actually a lot of the interaction is with the solicitors. Even if you buy a home that's not shared ownership, everyone complains about how long conveyancing takes and nobody has a clue what's going on. So a lot of what we've done is we built an app for the solicitors as well. So any conveyancer who specializes in shared ownership can sign up. They can be one of our partners, and we automate some of the conveyancing, and we let the resident know exactly where they are in the conveyancing process. So I don't want to just talk about housing association because there are other parties involved in staircasing, and I think that everybody can do a better job together. But just to answer your first question, how much work have we done with residents? We've done quite a lot. We try to get as much feedback from them as possible. Every time we want to launch a new feature, we'll try and call at least 10 residents and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. Is it worth our time? Do you guys want this? Do you guys want to use this? And we track every interaction that they have with the app to make sure that the things that we do build are actually being used and they found useful. But we try and crowdsource as much from them as possible. There's only 250,000 residents in shared ownership, right? It's not millions of people out there. It's not impossible to get most people's feedback.
And do you find that, within that lack of trust piece, that there is I don't know, is it quite even in terms of people mistrusting, which sounds like an odd way to say it, or do you find that certain communities are even less trusting because of, I guess I'm asking kind of from a diversity side, are we seeing it as some are more kind of aspirational and see it as almost like a right, and others are just very distrusting of it from the beginning?
I think there's geographical divides. We can't really target people because we don't have their email addresses, so we just kind of put things out there, and whoever wants to give us feedback can give us feedback. So I can't claim that I've managed to do perfect diversified feedback sessions, but there's a lot of people who get into shared ownership and they're very financially conscious. I've spoken to some people who are consultants making quite a bit of money in the city. They're just quite young and they're bought in shared ownership, and they literally have a spreadsheet that says, these are all my options. This is what happens if inflation goes up. This is what happens if house prices goes up. I'm like, oh wow, you guys can build the app for me. You guys are so smart. And then there are others who say, you know, shared ownership was my only way to get into the property ladder, and there's no way I can ever afford to staircase. It's never been a plan. And I didn't really think about it because no one told me, but my service charge is going up and my rent is going up and I don't really know what to do about it. And that's a ticking time bomb. So there's a huge diversity in terms of, you know, in London and outside of London, as well as within London, different people who are very different circumstances within shared ownership.
No, really interesting to hear. There's been a point made by Jade in the chat. Stairpay sounds like a really interesting product. Out of interest, is your platform also set up for the new 1% gradual staircasing option that was introduced as part of the new shared ownership model?
Yeah, so that's actually the first thing that we built, and then we found out that about 1% of shared ownership properties are adopting the new model. So it was a bit early to the market. But we have an integration with the land registry, which means that we can tell someone the HPI valuation of their home at any point. And if they want to transact, we can basically take a payment via open banking, which again is fully automated. And there's only a couple of documents that need executing, so we can automate those as well. So you can actually do it end to end on the app within a couple of minutes if you want to. But yeah, sadly, there's not many housing associations that have adopted the new model quite yet.
Fair enough. It's
at least we'll be ready when they do.
yeah. Well, let's say I've just seen that. It's the first I kind of heard of it myself, and I think that's part of the general issue with shared ownership is I don't think, and I hope I'm speaking correctly, and not many people really understand how it works. And when you talked about, that's why you said about that kind of standardized model and that standardized, you know, these are the 13 steps or 23 steps or whatever it might be. Yeah. I think people really understanding how the process works would be really, really beneficial for many people out there, especially in the private rented sector, who maybe want to have a look at it, because trying to find these properties on Rightmove and Zoopla are incredibly hard. Then you try to find a local RP that have maybe running it, and that's complicated. The whole thing is a very, you know, it's a bit of a minefield to try and work your way through, even if you've got an idea of the sector itself. And I guess that's what you're trying to change the narrative around. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, if you look at the Help to Buy scheme, that was super well advertised by the government. Everyone knows about the Help to Buy scheme. Did everyone fully understand how it worked with the equity loans and potentially, you know, ending up 5 years later with something you didn't quite know? I'm not sure, but most people jump into these schemes immediately because I think, great, I can get to the property ladder. I think the problem with shared ownership is that it didn't really have the same backing from the government in terms of publicity. And it's up to the sector to try and come together and create the right content to publicize it. And I don't think it's, you know, it's not like there's millions of homes in shared ownership available that you need to try and sell. There's, you know, a finite amount, and therefore you don't necessarily need to, you know, go above and beyond. But I wouldn't be surprised if with Help to Buy going off, it will become a more popular scheme. And hopefully over time, the supply of it will also grow. I expect that I'm not sure whether it'll come from housing association. There's a lot of private providers I was mentioning earlier who are coming in. And it's interesting to see the likes of, you know, Sage Homes, who's owned by Blackstone, one of the largest real estate investors in the world, piling into shared ownership. Why they're doing that is clearly a good asset. It's not just good for residents. But I think for shared ownership to become a mainstream product, there needs to be a lot more automation, because it's impossible to, you might be able to manage it with a portfolio of 100, 200 properties, but when you start getting into the thousands, you just need to give people a better experience. It's 2023, people just expect more from their landlord.
They do, and as you say, and I think that idea of being able to click on something and seeing the information you want is also like what's happened over the, you know, the internet era that we've had over the last 20, 30 years. And now it's, as I say, I remember looking at it a little while ago and I just gave up after a couple of hours. I was like, I have no idea where this sits. This is too complicated. And I think there's probably many people out there with a similar narrative or don't even know about it in the first place. There's a question there from Nick Lieb in the chat. Have you come across any housing associations that seem ahead of the curve with their staircasing process? And I guess following on from that, what's made them, I guess, better or standing out?
I think, I don't know if I'm allowed to name names because I guess I am sharing confidential information, but
maybe just say there's one in this region.
there's one particularly large one, who's one of the, I think, top 3 largest ones, who at least has fully digitized their, well, fully digitized is a strong word, but they have a website that gives you all the right information. You can download forms, and I think you can apply to Staircase via the website. I think every other shared ownership provider that I know, you still have to download a PDF and submit a PDF to your landlord saying, I own this property on this address, and I want to buy this much of the property when I currently own Y. And 90% of those fields, the housing association should already know. So as a resident, you must just be pulling your hairs out thinking, this is ridiculous. Why am I going through this? So I think at least that one has already done it. I think there's still a lot more to go, because I know that as soon as the application is submitted, it does just end up in an Excel sheet. So at least from the front end, it looks nice. From the back end, I don't think that there's too much there. I know that there's one slightly smaller one that has done some 1% transactions. And I think that's great. I think that they're encouraging it and they've seen that it's working well. There's 2, I was on a webinar recently where 2 mentioned that, they've tried to advertise staircasing, which I think is great. I don't think many housing associations do. I wouldn't be exaggerating to say 60% of residents I spoke to didn't actually know what staircasing was, which is baffling, given that that's the whole point of shared ownership, that you staircase to try to get to 100%. I think it's pretty crazy that they hadn't heard of it. So yeah, there's, different housing associations are trying to prioritize different things. There are some that are trying to pinpoint, strategic stock that they might want to get rid of, and therefore they go to those residents, say, I'll offer you 5% discount and free legal fees if you want to staircase to 100%. Is that the same as offering it to people who potentially don't want them to buy 100% of the property? No. So yeah, there is some movement, and some are definitely ahead of the curve, but I think most housing associations still think, oh yeah, whenever they feel like they want to buy 100%, they'll come to us, and therefore, we'll be there waiting, and we'll kind of give them the process that we have currently.
Why do you think that is?
What do I think that is? I think resources. I don't think anyone's doing it because they don't care. As I said, I've been working in tech for 6 years now, and it's my first time working in the social housing sector. And unlike the other sectors that I worked in before, which I won't mention, I actually think that everybody really cares about their job. Everyone loves their job, or everyone I've spoken to anyway, and really cares about the industry and their residents. I just think if you don't have the right resources, then you have to prioritize, right? And I feel like shared ownership isn't quite getting the love that it deserves.
I think that's totally fair, and I'm wondering whether or not there's also a lack of, as you say, kind of understanding and time spent internally on the processes of shared ownership. So teams don't necessarily know how the whole thing works, and so unless you have a specialized team in shared ownership, maybe it just kind of is another thing that you're expecting a general housing team to kind of add to their skill set and knowledge base, and actually that's already very, very vast.
Yeah, and I think it's often easier to say, this is the problem, we've got X many people calling and complaining, so let's set up a complaints team. Or I've heard of some housing association, when I was talking to them about investing in software, they were saying, oh, actually, we just employed a team of people who are going to pick up the phone and answer about complaints. I was like, well, how much is that costing you? Couldn't you just invest in better process so you wouldn't have to have all the complaints? And it's quite hard to stop and say, actually, process doesn't work, let's just build it from scratch.
Oh, I think we've lost you, Floris. We got you back. Hello.
Oh, I was kicked out. Don't know what happened.
Got you back.
Where was I? Now I was saying it's hard to stop sometimes and say our process isn't working, let's just start from zero and try and build a better one. It's a lot easier to try and play whack-a-mole and but sort of put out the fires as and when they come. And it is scary. I think there's a comment in the chat saying it feels overwhelming to start a new process when, you know, you don't have the resources. Well, getting back to my last point, well, what happens if you just leave it? It's only going to get worse. At some point, somebody has to make it happen. And I always try and say to people, you know, I don't know how many people here work in sales, but you always talk about finding your champion within an organization, and they try and sell it to everyone else. That champion always feels scared that they could look like an idiot if things go wrong. Well, actually, if your intentions were right, I think you're only really going to make progress, and you're going to, you know, people are going to take notice, and you're going to come across like the champion when things are improved. And yeah, it's hard and it's scary, but I think it's always worth it. And you can also rely on the people who are trying to help you with the technology. People always think that, you know, they need to get information from me, they need to get pricing, and then they go away and they talk for 3 months internally and try and figure out what's happened, you know, what's happening and what they need to do. I've spent a year building this. I know how it works. So try and, you know, get help from the technology providers who are coming to you, and take their view on, you know, what should you do next? How should you tackle this problem? How should you sell it internally, etc. It can be a collaborative process, and that is what we're doing with some of the largest players. And I think that works quite well because at least there's communication and dialogue.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that open communication piece is the key thing. I was having a look on a few things before we joined on today, and there was a report which was only came out yesterday. It was a news report that came out yesterday saying that Shared Ownership Resources, which is a project championing the interest of shared owners, says that some of their recommendations are very much in line with yours. So we had tackle mis-selling and deliver an affordable code of practice, reform affordability assessments, strengthen regulatory oversight, improve data collection, provide earlier and greater support for households where shared ownership is becoming financially unsustainable, and assess value for money for the shared ownership scheme, both the shared owners and the public purse. And Inside Housing only last week said that shared ownership residents in London won a court battle over the right to manage their own homes in a ruling that could have implications for leaseholders across the country. So I think part of the issue is that there isn't a positive media narrative around shared ownership either. So people are instantly going, we could have a look at this, but this could be problematic from the get-go. Jay, thank you very much for joining us today. Please do come in. It's thank you for coming along and engaging in today's debate.
Sorry, I've been leaving messages up to this point because someone's been mowing their lawn next door, so I'm back. I think there's been a few really interesting points. So like what Claire said in the chat about it can be overwhelming for the HAs and stuff to change their processes. But then Floris, you mentioned that there have been like developments that you're aware of that none of the owner occupiers even knew of staircasing. So, I mean, I guess it's kind of my question is, do you think that not just the HAs, but, you know, I'm Shed By, we're a property portal, that we should really be pushing the staircasing messaging from the very beginning of the buying process with a potential buyer? Or do you think it should be a little bit more dribs and drabs because it could be quite overwhelming? I mean, you know, buying a house, even on the open market, is incredibly convoluted, let alone adding shared ownership as a tenure to it. Do you think it could be a bit overwhelming for the buyer if they're kind of told about staircasing from the get-go?
Well, if you spin it around, say, would you ever buy 25% of the property knowing that you're going to have a landlord who owns 75% of it and not know how you're going to get the other 75? I think it's important that people know about it from the get-go. Should you market it to them from the get-go? Absolutely not, because realistically, you know, they can't afford it. There is a problem with people being forced to buy the very most that they can afford when they first buy a shared ownership property. So they're a bit on the back foot for the first few years. But there's very clear data that shows when people do staircase, and it's always, you know, at the end of the fixed rate of the mortgage, because that's when you can remortgage. Most staircasing happens with a remortgage. And it makes sense to do that. You know, if you get a 5-year fixed rate, then most people try to get the other half then. So I think what's important and what we try to do is we gather the information from the residents about, you know, what's your household income? What do you spend your money on? Would you like to staircase? And we try and get all this data, as well as knowing when their fixed rate on the mortgage is going to expire and how much their property's gone up in value since they bought it. And if we think it makes sense, then we'll send them notifications saying, hey, people in your situation have done staircasing in the past, and this is what's happened as a result. Take it or leave it. You know, that information sits with you. We're not going to shove it down your throat, but like, it's available to you. And I think, you know, you need to be soft in the approach because it's not for everyone. But you also need to be targeted, I think, and you know, with all kinds of sales, and staircasing is sales, really. That's why it sits in the sales team of every housing association. You need to sell to the people who, you know, can afford it, and it's affordable for them to do so, and it's a good idea. And then ultimately, it just sits with them, and they need to decide.
Yeah, I think that all sounds really, really sensible, to be fair. I mean, from our end, when we do content, we have full pages dedicated to staircasing and information around it, including selling your home as well, kind of all the next steps. But in any of our kind of overviews of shared ownership, where we have like high level or 101s, we always include like a small amount about staircasing. So if they're just getting on the property ladder, there's obviously lots about shared ownership and what that means to the buyer, but also your next steps in a smaller kind of capacity. But I also think it's interesting that you say that kind of soft approach as well, but also leads into what you said about kind of transparency on messaging and being clear and concise, because actually, even on social media to date, while people are a lot more educated about shared ownership now, people still go, oh, do I have to staircase? Do I have to buy more? And I think they sometimes don't realize that actually it is optional. You can buy 25% and stick with 25%. Or you might increase to 50, but never go to 100. So yeah, I think your platform sounds really interesting. And like I said earlier, I think it's good that you're doing the 1% increasing as well. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you for answering my question.
Thank you. I think, sorry, just to add to that, one thing that is key is, you know, when you're writing, and your articles, I think, are probably the best. That's why they come up top on every SEO search about shared ownership. But you know, when you tell people about shared ownership, you could write a 50-page white paper about how it works and the ins and outs, and no one would read it. So I can see why you have a slightly smaller section on staircasing. But what I think is really key, and not many people talk about this, is what happens if you don't staircase. Because people always say, you know, when we created our scenario planner, which is one of our newest features, we tell people, look, you could staircase or you could sell your property. And initially we thought those are the only two options, but actually speaking to residents for a year, there is a third option, and it's a big option, and that's doing nothing. And doing nothing has serious consequences. And that's, you know, service charge going up, rents going up, your situation getting worse, and potentially being stuck with loads and loads of you could get stuck in debt, you could get stuck in negative equity. And I think no one talks about what happens if you don't staircase or if you don't sell. And there's a very big difference between selling because you want to and selling because you're screwed and you can't staircase, and there's no reverse staircasing in most housing associations, and therefore your like dream of buying a home has become unsustainable. So I think people need to talk more about not staircasing as well.
Completely agree. And I think that's probably the other side is it is one of these things that there's always, when people talk about shared ownership, there's that risk, and people see risk and get worried about it. And I think it would still be very odd. I think if you're going to maybe start on the shared ownership journey, then you're okay. But I think if you're trying to buy somewhere, you're going, right, well, 50% of it's yours and 50% of it isn't, and you own trying to buy something which is already partway through the shared ownership journey from someone who's already gone through it and maybe selling halfway along, that in itself is still very, very alien to a lot of people, and certainly, you know, to the vast majority. So that in itself probably needs some work as well. I think there's a lot to do on the education piece, unfortunately, around shared ownership. I agree with you that the 5% deposit and the Help to Buy and everything else got lots of traction behind it, and people bought into it without always knowing everything about it, but at least they bought into it. Shared ownership is still very much seen as this scary alternative that can work if you've known people who've used it, but otherwise it's quite complicated. And I like the fact that you've said, look, there are lots of steps and we just need to be more transparent about them.
Ultimately, buying a home, as much as it is, you know, putting a roof over your head and all of that, it is also a financial decision, right? So like when you go to buy shares in a company, it says, you know, big disclaimer, financial products don't always work out, and shared ownership needs to be quite similar in a way, because you are signing up to a financial relationship with a housing association. And, you know, people know what happens in most scenarios because most of it has already happened. Shared ownership has been around for 40 years. So just, you know, spelling out, these are the things that can happen. take it or leave it. And at that point, people can make their own decisions, but you can't hide and just say, yeah, buy it. And then when someone's in, say, oh yeah, by the way, rent's going up, service charge is going up. Oh, can you not afford the staircase? I'm sorry. You bought it now.
Well, particularly with everything going on with the market at the moment. Floris, we've basically run out of time, so thank you so much for bringing it to the table today, and a really interesting discussion actually on something that definitely has doesn't always get the media traction that it needs. Are there any final points you'd like to make before we wrap up today?
The last one that I've made a couple of times is if you do have a shared ownership portfolio and there are residents who might benefit from any of the stuff, then it's free and we built it for them. So even if you as a housing association don't want to take it up, I think it's worth telling your residents about it, getting them to sign up, and getting them to benefit from it.
Fantastic. A couple of people asked for the presentation. So I put the link to the mailing list in the chat. If you want to sign up there, I'll also share Floris's details so that you can get in touch with him for more information about the app and all the work Pluto are doing. But until then, just a big thank you to Floris for bringing this to the table today. Thank you to everyone who could join us. I hope it was as interesting to you as it was for me. And I look forward to seeing you all at a future roundtable. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.